Good afternoon. It's 4 o'clock in Radio Cairo, and this is World of Info. My name is Dr. Amr MABROUK, and I'm with you here on this beautiful Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. And yes, today is the World of Info, and as usual in the summertime, usually we do a lot of episodes about summer reading and the world of books. And today we are going to present 4 interesting books that I think deserve to be read because they are more or less interesting, and one of them is definitely related to what we are living today, or maybe two. So the 4 books are Musa's Cross by Haitham Dabbour, خريدة القاهرة by Hamid Mohammed Hamid, Dr. Ahmed Okasha and his autobiography, Myself, Stories from My Biography, and The Epidemic That Killed 180,000 Egyptians by Muhammad Abul Ghar. So, stay with us and stay tuned to these 4 interesting books of today. And you know, of course, the rule of the game. And the rule of the game is very simple. Should we read this book? Should we toss it? Should we skim it? Or should we go in depth? And usually, I will not waste your time. And when I choose a certain book, I think that you might have to turn into it and read it and grasp it. So we'll start with a summer reading, The Musa's Cross by Haitham Dabbour. Well, this is an interesting book. It's a thriller, it's a novel, it's a fiction, but it has a lot of true facts about it. And the idea of having such a novel where in St. Catherine Monastery and in Sinai, this is quite interesting. And to present to the readers a lot of information, that most of it is real, as he has discussed in his first pages, about the presence of the monks, how the monks reached there, how the monastery was called the St. Catherine Monastery, and how we had the misinterpretation that originally it was built for St. Catherine, but it was built mainly for Christians who believed that this holy site of where Moses talked to God should deserve to have a church in it. And this was built in very early Christianity, before ever relating the monastery to St. Catherine. And the fact that we have presented before about St. Catherine itself, when one of the monks who were living in the monastery dreamt that St. Catherine corpse was buried nearby, or was there nearby, and he went and found it, and he buried it and installed it in the monastery. And by time, due to the number of pilgrims who visited this monastery and this church in appreciation to the myth of, or the story of St. Catherine, they have chosen to change the name, or the name was automatically changed to St. Catherine. And the most important thing about this monastery, not just being in this very beautiful holy site for all the 3 religions, where Moses talked to God, but also the fact that this monastery carries one of the biggest and the most complete collection of icons that are related even from the time of the building of the original church in this site, from the 3rd and the 4th century after Christ, and of course onwards, because there was a lot of icon destruction that happened in the 9th century. But this icon destruction, when they considered that painting the icons is heretic, this icon destruction didn't reach the St. Catherine Monastery, and therefore it has the most complete, best collection of icons. Also, the monastery is famous for its beautiful library, which is full of books, which are definitely one of the oldest and rarest books, and the monks are keeping good care of these books and this heritage, because as we know that in the 19th century and even before that, they have been robbed by adventurous people who came and tried to bribe their own way to get some of these rare collection books and rare collection of Bibles. So when we're talking about the St. Catherine Monastery and putting a very juicy adventure that happened between the walls of the monastery, I think this is very interesting. And I think that Haitham Dabur has made a very intelligent job, especially that he has shown how the monks are very pious people. They are very dedicated, and at the same time they are very well protective of their heritage. And this, I think, the message that you will get out of reading this thriller novel, fictitious novel, after you finish it. The idea that he has described in a lot of the celebrations of the anniversary of the monastery and the use of the guns and the use of the bells, all this really, I find it very interesting, and I believe that he did a very good, well-researched book. He has traveled with us through the monastery. He has traveled with us through the mountains of Moses, and also in nearby churches. And for this, I give him the tribute that anyone of the young generations who read the book will be motivated to visit this important place in the Egyptian heritage, a place where all the three religions met and meet, and of course the yearly gathering that happens in commemorating the conference between the different religions that happen in this site every year, almost in October, and also the fact that a lot of people visit this monastery and climb the mountain following the footsteps of Moses. I think it's the book is, or the novel is, very stimulating for all of us to try to grasp it, to understand it, and to visit St. Catherine, a place that I find that it's very dear to me. It is full of stories. Behind every stone there is a story, and as you see the monks, and as you have the chance to talk to any of them, you will feel how these people are very dedicated, very clean, and very clear, and very pure. So, Musa's Cross by Haitham Dabur. It's now one of the bestseller books in the bookstores of Egypt, and I'm happy that it has given a window on St. Catherine and its beautiful monastery and the mountains, and enjoy the reading. It's a typical summer read. So you're still listening to World of Info. My name is Dr. Amr MABROUK, and today is the World of Books, and yes, we are going to another book after the break. You're still listening to the World of Info, and today is the World of Books, and the second book that we are going to talk about is Kharidat al-Qahira by Hamid Muhammad Hamid. And yes, the name of the book is very attractive. I think everybody who finds this beautiful name, or this very strange name, will be motivated to open pages of the first few pages of the book to understand, did he mean Garidat al-Qahira or Kharidat al-Qahira? So Garidat al-Qahira means the Journal of Cairo, and this could be a book that talks about the history of Cairo. But Kharidat al-Qahira, this is a rarely used name. And yes, Muhammad Hamid has decided to choose a name that will attract your attention. So it will stimulate you to read what about it. And Muhammad Hamid is a young chap, has a degree in pharmacy, graduate from 2005, and he has a diploma in anthropology. And he has written some beautiful books, and he decided to write some short stories about the history of Cairo and the human beings who lived in Cairo for a very long time. And yes, the fact of the word Kharida means that it's something special or something precious. And yes, it is a word that is rarely used nowadays, but yet it's interesting because he decided that he is going to excavate some of the most beautiful, interesting subjects that are related to the history of Cairo, and he's going to tell us some of them. Yes, and he said this is not a history book, and this is not definitely an archaeology book. You will find a lot of interesting information, historical information, and it's well documented, and the references are true. But he said that the writing this book or reading this book doesn't really entitle you to understand the historical sequence of this. But he decided to take some photographs or photo shoots of certain happenings in the history of Cairo that definitely will attract our attention. And yes, the idea of writing a few pages about every now and then, you would understand that he has decided that he will take us slowly but surely through the history of Cairo. We started from Ibn Tulun, the man who made some mutiny against the Abbasids and decided to build himself a sultanate and a special private state of Cairo, of Egypt. And onwards, we go through the Fatimid period. And after the Fatimids, we simply go more into the Ayyubids and in the Mamluk and even to the Ottoman invasion. He decided that he's going to put his input and his emphasis into different points and telling us some stories of how the people who went up to the throne of Egypt, and some of them acted so mysteriously. He talked about great sultans, weak ones, great people of kind heritage, and people who were dedicated for the cause, people who felt to be that honesty and keeping principles should be more important than life itself. As an example of Tumambai, the man who decided, who was the nephew of Qunso al-Ghuri, and the one who went up to the throne in such a very dangerous situation, just at the end of the Mamluks' time, and just after the defeat in Margdabeq, when the Egyptian army was defeated by the Ottomans after the treason of Khair Bey, or who was very famous for the word, or his nickname, Khaim Bey, or the traitor. Yes, the Egyptian Sultan was betrayed by one of his generals, and yes, he has fallen with a stroke and later on died in the desert, in the war, in the battle, and nobody found his body. And yes, Tumambai decided that he's going to be the Sultan and accepted the kingdom of Egypt and tried to defend with the weak army that was left after the defeat in Margdabeq. And even he stood bravely in Raidaniya, and unfortunately he was defeated. But yet he decided not to surrender his force or surrender himself, but he went on in doing a lot of skirmishes with the Ottoman army and trying to arrange strong resistance among the Egyptians against the invading Ottomans. And unfortunately, he was also betrayed. So when we are talking about principles that Tumambai decided to give up his life for his principles and for the protection of Egypt, and when he faced the Sultan after being arrested, the Sultan said to him, "Why are you fighting me?" And simply Tumambai said, "Because this is our country, and this is my country, and I am the Sultan of this country, and you are an invader." He has seen the world so clear. And he said, "You are not braver than us. And if you have a brave knight, let him come over and we have a duel, and I will show you what it is to be a real knight in shining armor." Selim I was very impressed by Tumambai, and he thought that he's going to keep him and spare his life. But Khair Bey, the traitor, took the ear of Selim I and said to him, if you leave him, he will arrange more resistance. Kill the guy. And this what Selim I did. And he simply decided to hang him on the gallows in front of Zuwayla Gate. And yes, to Mumbai, for the matter of principles and for the matter of nationalism, went to the gallows with raising his head and his brave attitude, asking the people who were there just to recite the Fatiha for him. And he has given up his life very easily. And yes, the people of Egypt decided to name to Mumbai al-Mitwalli, or the guy who is being put on the throne, or the king or the sultan. And they have decided to keep faith into Mumbai, calling him their sultan and their king. They decided that they're going to keep to Mumbai in their hearts, and they are going to throw in the back of their minds Khair Bey, the traitor. They decided to keep the people that helped Egypt and had the principles and had the bravery in their hearts, and the traitors just to throw them away. Well, Kharidat al-Qahira has described different situations, but the most touchy one was about Mumbai and about Khair Bey. Gives you the explanation of how people act differently in times of trouble, how people look for their own benefits, and how others are simply defending their principles. So, Kharidat al-Qahira, or Precious Things About Cairo, by Muhammad Hamid, an interesting book that deserves to be read. An introduction, and a beautiful introduction to the history of Cairo. So you're still listening to World of Info, and today we have presented two of our beautiful books, or what we love to call them summer readings. Kharidat al-Qahira by Muhammad Hamid, and Salib Musa by Haitham Dabour. And still we have two more books to go before we reach 5 p.m. And yes, we are the World of Info. And yes, today is the World of Books with Dr. Amr MABROUK, going to you through Studio 3 from Radio Cairo, the European Local Service. So when we talk about the third book, well, this is a book about a very dear man to me, and his name is Professor Ahmed Okasha. And Professor Ahmed Okasha is one of the great pioneers of psychiatry in Egypt, a man who has held on his shoulders the new scope of psychiatry. He went on trying to navigate in this world, and in Egypt and in the Middle East, increased the awareness of the people about psychological problems and about mental illness. And he insisted always on saying that there is nobody who's called crazy. There are certain illness that deserves to be managed and treated, and people who have this illness should have their integrity and their well-being very well respected by the society. And I always believe that Professor Ahmed Okasha has put always on the stake his reputation as a scientist in order to improve this percussion of the care of the mentally ill patients, and to give them their privacy and their respect. Dr. Ahmed Okasha has decided to write his biography with the help of the editor, Muhammad Said Saleh. And I believe the result is very interesting. The book gives us a glimpse of Ahmed Okasha as a youngster, as a young chap, the youngest of the brothers of a family that belonged to the upper middle class. His father was a retired general in the army. His elder brother was an officer in the cavalry, or in the what we call the tankers, And yes, this man in particular name was Sarwat Okasha, a man who had a great influence on Ahmad Okasha and a great influence on Egypt. He was one of the liberal officers, and he was a very enlightened man who had a real urge to read and understand, and who loved all sorts of culture. So he changed from an officer and one who was involved in the liberal officers, and at the same time a revolutionary officer, and at the same time a politician, and a real clever military man who was involved in the first war with Israel in 1948. So the man has shifted his career, and Nasser has found out that his colleague in the liberal officers was a man of great interest in culture, and that he deserves to have a glimpse and improve the culture of the Egyptians by getting into becoming the Minister of Culture. He was giving 2 tenors, and during these 2 tenors he has done a great job by founding or resurrecting the Cairo Symphony Orchestra, by founding the Cairo Ballet Company, and by doing a great effort in renovating the museums, in saving the monuments, the Egyptian monuments in Upper Egypt after the erection of the High Dam, and in protection of all sorts of the heritage of the Egyptians, supporting the dancing companies of Egypt, like Rida or Bahira companies. And all this has seen a great rise as well in his relation to the reading books and publishing books and printing books. So Sarwat Okasha was a great influence on Egypt, and he had a great influence on Ahmad Okasha. Ahmad Okasha, after graduating from the medical school, was very much interested in psychiatry, and he traveled to have his fellowship in medicine, internal medicine, and also to have an education in psychiatry. And so when he came back to Egypt in 1964-65, he decided that he's going to enroll in psychiatry and get much enrolled in psychiatry and not into neurology. And he was faced by a great challenge at that time. And by time and by his charismatic personality, he was able to help the processing and the acceptance of the psychiatric disorders and the management of psychiatric disorders. So Professor Ahmad Okasha was and is a pioneer in the field of psychiatry, and he was able to convince the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine to have a lecture, almost a yearly lecture, to all the students of the medical school. Every year he would present with his great charisma a small course of lectures to the youngsters, the young medical students. From the first year till the 5th year, they will receive, they are entitled to receive an introduction to psychiatry, where all the class would sit and listen carefully to what Ahmad Okasha had to say. And I was one of these students in the early 80s, and I had the pleasure of listening to his lectures, understanding his way and his clever, charismatic way of addressing the needs of the youngsters and talking about psychiatric disorders, and at the same time conveying the message of the psychological well-being is important for having a successful life. So reading the book and finding a way to understand the success of Professor Ahmad Okasha in building a career and building and nurturing a great advantage of understanding of the needs of the society, and at the same time using all his connections to help this field, definitely deserves to be respected. And I believe one of the great important movements that Professor Okasha has done was his founding of the Psychiatry Center in our faculty, in Faculty of Medicine at Shams University, and he was able to use to pull all the strings possible to do the connection and to do the contacts with the people and the ministers of different ministries, trying to acquire a piece of land and trying to get enough founding money from all perspectives and different perspectives for the people to help in building such a distinguished center. And no wonder that this center was given the maiden name of Professor Ahmed Okasha Center. And of course, the idea of going through and trying to convince the people to understand that having a mental ill patient in the family is not a taboo. It's not an insult. It's not something that people should be disgusted about. It's just like any illness. And therefore, he has done his share in that. He has used his tenure as the president of the International Society of Psychiatrists in order to build bridges of understanding between different societies of psychiatry from all over the world, and introducing the Egyptian experience, and writing a lot of literature and papers in different journals from all over the world about psychiatry and about psychiatry in the Middle East and psychiatry in Egypt. Of course, this is very important. I think also one of the very interesting research that he has done was about the parapsychology and dreams, and his study about the Tsar and the famous Tsar and the famous use of the drums in order to what they think, these Tsar people, that they're going to fight away the demons that are taking control of the people, and what Ahmed Okasha thinks it is definitely part of more or less like meditation, and part, of course, of emotional involvement with the atmosphere of the Tsar. And of course, through the pages of the book, you will find a great part of it tribute to Dr. Sarwat Okasha, who he himself was involved in writing a lot of books about his culture, heritage, and his going through the lives. And of course, he had the time to write his memoirs. And of course, when we talk about Dr. Sarwat Okasha, we'll talk about the dedication of working hard, even until the early years of his 80s, and just before his death, he went on working continuously in order to finish a lot of books and writings as well. So a tribute to Dr. Ahmed Okasha, myself, or story about his own biography, edited by Muhammad Sayyid Saleh. I think it's a book that deserves to be read, and I think Dr. Ahmed Okasha has kept his oath in keeping the secrecy of his own patients. And if Dr. Ahmed Okasha tells us about his patients, I think he can fill on thousands of pages that will deal with important historical figures, as he was the sole psychiatrist for a lot of the governors of the Arab world, and an avid listener to their problems and their troubles for many years. Something that he kept on doing this job honestly and keeping the secrets of these people. And of course, this gives us back to the most important thing that we'll get out of this episode and out of this book, is that integrity and self-respect are definitely much more important than getting some minor gains. Dr. Ahmed Okasha could have made huge fortunes from exposing a deceased governor, or a governor that has fallen under the what is sometimes called the Arab Spring, and yet he kept his part of the deal. He taught his students and his followers and his colleagues that professional secrecy is the most important thing, and maintaining this secrecy should always be one of the great and most important goals of a physician, and especially of the psychiatrist, because he's the one who sees people however great they are in their times of weakness and despair. So, Professor Ahmed Okasha, one of our mentors, and really I enjoyed reading his book. And I suggest that you, our dear listeners, should try and understand it and read it as well. So you're still listening to the World of Info, and today is the World of Books, and still we are left with one more book to go, but after the break. So you're still listening in this beautiful afternoon in Cairo to the World of Info, and we are coming from Studio 3. My name is Dr. Amr MABROUK, and today is the World of Books. And yes, the last book of today, which I think is very interesting because it is very related to what we are as the world suffering from. And it talks about the COVID-19, and it talks about another epidemic of influenza, and that is the Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu, as everybody knows, was the flu that happened in the late months of the First World War, and it was a devastating epidemic that has taken up more lives than the World War I has taken. Almost 50 million people succumbed to the influenza all over the world. It was definitely a pandemic, and the most important thing about it is that it was very well documented. Why was it well documented? Simply because the world has had more its progress. Every once in a while, and every maybe 5 or 10 years or 20 years, the world has seen epidemics, whether these epidemics were like the Black Death or the plague that happened regularly in the whole world, killing hundreds and thousands and even millions of people, and marking a great epidemic that happened in the 1345 onwards in the 14th century, that has spread in the whole world, in the whole old world, and killing millions of people. Even in Egypt, almost half of the population died in these terrible times in the 14th century. And this was during the tenure of Sultan Hassan. But the documentation of the Spanish flu happened, and the people who died from Spanish flu were millions, and a lot of famous people had this flu. Some of them perished and died, like the famous painters, or the famous Sykes, the famous minister of Foreign Affairs, who was just 39 when he died from the Spanish flu in Paris, maybe in 1919. So what's new in the Spanish flu thing is that a book has been published recently by Dr. Mohammed Abulghar, talking about the epidemic that killed 180,000 Egyptians. Well, so the Spanish flu arrived to Egypt? Yes, it did. But we had the misinformation, because in this period, these were commemorating or at the same time coexisting with the 1919 revolution. And in 1919 revolution, we were celebrating in 2019 the centennial of this huge and pure popular movement, the revolution of 1919, when the Egyptians made a revolt against the British occupation, asking for their independence and choosing their leaders, Saad Zaghloul and his colleagues, to represent them in the famous Paris Convention, which was held after World War I. And it's in these times the Egyptians had the aspiration to get their freedom from the British occupation, and at the same time Egypt, which was a member of the Ally by force, when a lot of Egyptians were forced to work in the different Allied forces armies, whether this was in Sinai or in Syria and Palestine, or in Gallipoli, or in the Western Front. The Egyptians were there, and the Egyptians have endured a lot of losses as they were members in the carriers or in the workers with the different armies that were fighting. And a lot of them were maltreated, and a lot of them died, whether they died from diseases or died from the war and got hit and killed. And after the great effort of one of the Egyptian doctors who fought his way to convince the whole world that the section in the graveyards in the Somme has to include also Egyptians who were buried there, not to be Ottomans, not to be part of the Allies, but to be Egyptians. And the Egyptian flag should be put in this huge cemetery that carries with great dignity and respect the remains of a lot of Egyptians who lost their lives in World War I. So what happened in the last months of World War I? An epidemic started, and it couldn't find a better chance for this virus to spread, because at that terrible time the whole world was suffering from the war. A lot of the whole population of the world were suffering from malnutrition. They were fatigued. They were young people at age and very old at their bodies and at their physique and at mainly their psyche. And so the virus just spread like that, swarming with infections, and it has affected the young people more than the old, which is definitely different than the COVID-19, because the COVID-19 has more affinity to the old or the malnourished population or the chronically ill patients. But at that period of time, there were no antibiotics, there were no management, there were no proper management, and yet the people who were affected most were the youngsters. And we have seen even the President, Woodrow Wilson, the American president, suffered from the Spanish flu, and yet he survived. So why was it called Spanish flu? It was called Spanish flu simply because it is in this period of time that Spain was a neutral country. And being a neutral country, it was not involved in the war. And so the Spanish experience was delineated in all the reports. The number of mortalities, the number of morbidities, the number of people who were affected, everything was put clearly, and all the newspapers reported, the Spanish newspapers reported that. While the other areas where this flu has attacked the populations which were suffering from the war, the losses that happened among the army and among the people were considered to be a national secret. So there was no mention about how many people died, especially in the last months of the war, and how many people got hit by the influenza until the end of the war that happened in the late 1918, and this was the first wave. Yes, there was a first wave, and then a second one, and then a third one. It went on from 18, 19, and 20. When we talk about the first wave that happened in the last few months of 1818 and reached a peak in March, April, and then decreased a bit, and then started again by August. And it ended again, and then afterwards it had a small rise again, or a small attack again, in the early months of 1920. So this is a bit weird. So where was Egypt at that time? All the books or the historians of Egypt who have written about this critical period in Egyptian history were very much involved in telling the minute details of Saad Zaghloul and his colleagues. It was telling exactly eyewitness talks and presentations and articles about the revolution and about the number of people who were deceased and shot by the Brits, and every minute detail about the revolution and about the people who were acting in it, about the enemies of the people and the foes of the people and the friends of the people. Everything was described, and no mention in these history books about the Spanish flu. So this gave us the wrong impression, as the youngsters or the grandchildren of these people that simply the virus was not as prominent as it was in Europe and the States. Well, actually, this was totally strange, because this was not true. When Dr. Abul Ghar went back to newspapers, and he found that these newspapers were describing in full details the number of patients that were rising and the attacks of the influenza and of the Spanish flu, and how a lot of people were suffering from it, and how simply. So what were the references that there were a lot of Egyptians got infected with the influenza in this epidemic or pandemic? Well, this was, as I said before, through definitely the newspapers. And he was able to get, Dr. Abul Ghar was able to get a lot of publications about this time, which were describing the mode of combating the infection, some showing the number of patients, and at the same time discussing how should we deal with such a problem. And it even contained some advice from physicians. And one of these physicians, who was working in Aswan, an Egyptian physician, has described in a very clear sentences and wordings what we should be done to combat the infection. And strange enough, all the protective measures and the quarantine were followed up at this period at the same time, like the period which was followed later on, 100 years later, and the use of masks and everything. So when we talk about this period, we find the history books didn't write anything, and we found the newspapers that were discussing the virus opening and the influenza epidemic. But also added to that were the British authorities were responsible for the health sector. And these archives of the health sector, which was later on the Ministry of Health, were found out to be in Britain, and of course copies of that in some of the universities in the United States. And reading and analyzing all this information, which Dr. Abul Ghar was able to find, he was related to the fact that the first wave that happened in the late 1918 didn't affect much Egypt, but the second wave that happened in August in 1919 had an impact and had a lot of infected people. But in 1920, the third wave was minimal, and its effect on Egyptians were minimal. Also, there was the Milner Committee. That was one of the byproducts of 1919 revolution, when the British decided that they're going to send this committee, and in order to write a report about Egypt health and about its own education and its own health system. And in Milner, which was boycotted by Saad Zaghloul, it was found out that the Egyptians at that period of time were extensively malnourished. They came out of World War I with great increase in the prices of the commodities and very low salaries and incomes for the Egyptians. And this attributes to the fact that why a lot of Egyptians suffered from this illness, especially the youngsters. So these victims were victims first of malnourishment and poverty, and this led to the increased effect. And of course, this was due to the occupation and due to World War I. So reading about the interesting epidemic that killed a lot of Egyptians in 1919 epidemic, or 1918-19, or the Spanish flu, or the Spanish influenza, is a glimpse about history, and comparing this with the flu or the COVID-19 of what the whole world is suffering from, will give you an idea and give you a comparison of what is happening. So today was the World of Info, and today I presented to you 4 books that deserve to be read. The Cross of Musa by Haitham Dabbour, Kharidat al-Qahira, or by Hamid Muhammad Hamid, Dr. Ahmed Okasha, myself, stories and tales from my own biography, edited by Muhammad Sayyid Saleh, and the epidemic that killed 180,000 Egyptians in 1918-1919 by Muhammad Abdul. This was a world of books from the world of info in Radio Cairo, and these were a glimpse of some of the summer readings that Egypt is reading today. I hope you have enjoyed the show, and I hope that you'll join us next Thursday. My name is Amr MABROUK, and we'll be with you next Thursday, same time, same station. Stay tuned to Radio Cairo.